Welcome to With One Accord, the Houston Chamber Choir podcast. I'm St. John Flynn, host of Behind the Music. Today's episode is made possible in part by the generous support of Silvercrest Asset Management Group, providing an unparalleled level of quality investment advice. Joining me this time is writer, producer, director, and pianist Sarah Rothenberg, who is artistic director of DACAMERA of Houston. And that is an organization that has collaborated with the Houston Chamber Choir on several occasions. Sarah, welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about when DACAMERA and the Houston Chamber Choir have collaborated. I know that we can talk about, I think it was 2011, when the choir and DACAMERA collaborated on, I think, the 40th anniversary of the opening of the Rothko Chapel in Houston.
Yes, and I would have to search my memory to get all of the chronology right, but certainly our collaboration associated with Rothko Chapel is our most celebrated one, I would say, as it's ended up being on a really critically acclaimed CD produced by ECM, which is a legendary European Munich-based recording label that has specialized in contemporary music. And so this was around the iconic choral work, Rothko Chapel by Morton Feldman, which was written in 1972 and was commissioned by John and Dominique de Menil to be performed in the Rothko Chapel. The story behind that is the chapel itself. Mark Rothko was no longer alive when the chapel opened in 1971, and Morton Feldman, who was a close friend of his, came to the opening, and at that time the de Menils asked him to write a piece for the chapel, and it was premiered 1 year later in 1972, and it's become a recognized masterpiece of the latter part of the 20th century, and has been a kind of ambassador of the Rothko Chapel to the rest of the world. When we worked with the composer Kaya Sariaho, she told me that she had thought Rothko Chapel was a kind of metaphorical name for the musical work, and then found out later there was an actual building. So it's a very special place, and it's been a source of really special collaboration with Houston Chamber Choirs. The work is for chorus and percussion, solo viola, and celeste. And that grew into a whole CD that also involved works of John Cage, which were for choir unaccompanied, and then I play on that CD Cage's piano piece In a Landscape and piano works of Erik Satie. So you get this kind of avant-garde trajectory from Erik Satie to John Cage to Morton Feldman.
What was it like working with Robert Simpson and the Chamber Choir?
Well, the Chamber Choir is one of the jewels of Houston. We have collaborated on such works as Stravinsky Les Noces, with the Dutch conductor Reinbert de Leeuw conducting us. We have done, David Lang, A Little Matchstick Girl, Pulitzer Prize winning work that has become a real contemporary classic. So having Bob Simpson in town and being able to count on his exceptionally high standards and the way he crafts these performances with his carefully selected singers, it's a wonderful opportunity every time we get a chance to collaborate. And it's always been, they've always been wonderful collaborations. They really have. And we try to select special works. And I think often we've ended up doing works that we would not have done without the chamber choir, and the chamber choir venture into new territory that they may not have programmed just on their own series, certainly especially with some of the prominent contemporary composers that we've been able to work together with. I mean, David Lang was down here for the David Lang performance, and we had expected to do Julia Wolf's Anthracite Fields, which got canceled because of COVID, and we certainly still hope that we can come back to that in the future.
Let's talk a little bit about the chapel, because that will give us a sense of the sort of the ethos, the atmosphere of Morton Feldman's piece. The chapel it's not a chapel in the traditional sense of the word, is it?
No. The Dominials wanted very much for it to be a non-denominational space. And I think what's remarkable about the space is that it has an aura of being a sacred space, a spiritual space, which is separate from any religion. If anything, the religion there is the religion of abstraction. You know, you have these 12 enormous paintings by Mark Rothko, which you are surrounded by. So you actually enter into the paintings. And Mark Rothko famously said that he was making big paintings because he wanted them to be intimate. And that seems a bit of a contradiction, but he says when you look at a small painting, you're outside of the painting looking at it. But when you're in front of a large painting, you actually enter into the painting, and that becomes a three-dimensional truth in Rothko Chapel. So it's a kind of monument to abstraction, and that fits very well with what Morton Feldman was after in his music. And then I think the other thing which is important at Rothko Chapel is its history and commitment to human rights, which contributes to the very special aura of meditation and contemplation that that space provides.
I think one of the most striking things, certainly for me, when I first went to the Rothko Chapel was, on face value, the Rothko paintings are just big canvases painted black. But when you spend time in that space and you allow yourself to be enveloped in that aura, you realize that those paintings are far from just black canvases. There are all sorts of color variations, etc., that really draw you in.
Yes, and I see you have a Rothko behind you, don't you?
Yes, it's not an original, mind you.
But very appropriate. Yeah, it's true, and this is something that the composer Taishan Sori, who we recently commissioned in collaboration with Rothko Chapel for the 50th anniversary of the chapel. This is something that he has talked about too, because we brought him down to spend time in the chapel before composing this piece. And he was so struck by the longer you stay there, it's almost as though the paintings seem to change. You know, you feel like your eyes are playing tricks on you, because the other thing that happens is because of the oculus where the light comes in, the light itself changes. And you realize that there's no such thing as a fixed vision of something. You know, we live in a photographic world where you take a picture of something and that's how it looks. But in fact, the light is constantly changing and the perspective of the viewer is constantly changing, and you move in the chapel also. You don't necessarily just sit still. You know, you walk around, you see the paintings. So there's a constant change in the paintings and in one's perspective, and you discover, as you say, that it's not black, it's purple, it's all kinds of things.
Talk a little bit about the role of the choir in Feldman's piece, because it's unusual. It's not the standard choir performance where they stand and sing.
Yes, well, for one thing, speaking of abstraction, there are no words, and that in and of itself is unusual for a choral work, and that fits very much with the non-denominational aspect of the chapel itself, but also the whole idea of abstraction. So the choir and the piece also, I think, comes off as an extremely spiritual piece, despite the fact that there's absolutely no program to it, because there's a very strong sense of ritual it begins with timpani, with the percussion. There's this kind of rumbling that you don't know exactly where it's coming from. There's a solo viola that is quite mournful and beautiful. And the choir has a very ethereal, otherworldly role as they move in and out of the instruments. So it's a unique work. When it was composed, I don't think there was anything else at all like that. Although I did discover in the process of putting together this concert that became the 50th, no, yes, the 40th anniversary concert, these John Cage choral pieces, which also were without text at all. So it's a very abstract approach to choral writing, which is very much like these abstract paintings without an identifiable subject, I think.
One of the things that, certainly from your perspective, that is unusual perhaps in Rothko Chapel in the music is that the keyboard instrument is a celeste.
Yeah, and the keyboard role in that piece is really quite minimal, and the celeste is kind of an expansion of the percussion colors. Color is an overwhelming aspect of Morton Feldman's music, both in terms of instrumentation, but also in terms of the harmonies, which he invents. They're not normal triadic harmonies, but they're harmonies that have tremendous resonance in them. This was something he had tremendous talent for. And the way the sounds of the celeste, which is a bell-like keyboard instrument, where it looks like a very small keyboard instrument for those who don't know, but you're actually, it's a percussion instrument like bells, but you play them from a keyboard, and there's a pedal which sustains the sounds. And so color between those sounds, the sounds of the percussion, the string solo instrument of the viola, and then these voices that go in and out, and the fact that there's very little sense of attack in the sounds. The same way in Rothko's paintings, the color seems to emerge from the canvas rather than to be put onto the canvas. Yeah. And I think that is what goes on with Feldman's sound world as well.
Rothko Chapel, the music and that performance is sort of very much in your wheelhouse, because yes, you are a pianist, but you're more than a pianist, aren't you? Your creativity extends beyond just the piano.
I think I've always had a kind of holistic view to these things. It always feels to me that I'm doing the same thing, but I'm using different media to do them. So I do a lot of thinking when I'm at the piano practicing. That's kind of at the core of what I do and who I am. Even if I don't have a performance coming up, it's just incredibly important to my psychological well-being, as my family would tell you, for me to have my piano time. That's just, I think a musician, that becomes a way of life. So for me, that's where a lot of things start. But I've always been extremely connected to visual art, and that was one of the things that really lured me to Houston. Was this, I first came to Houston to perform on a DACAMERA concert at the Menil Collection, and was just so in love with the intimacy of the Menil Collection and the relationship one can have to the art, and the idea that, for me, it immediately inspired this idea of doing concerts in conjunctions with the exhibit. And then I also write, but the writing, I feel, is very much about exploring what my perceptions are about music and what these relationships are between music and painting, between music and literature. And that's why my position at DACAMERA is such a wonderful one for me, because it's this, when I came here, it really felt like a kind of empty canvas, and that this was a place where I could try to bring all of these things together and explore them and have the resources, both artistically and inspiration wise, to bring these things together.
Can you talk about specific periods where you see the same sort of thrust, if you like, in the music as well as in the visual art?
Yeah, well, I think with abstract expressionism, that's a really strong one. The relationship between Morton Feldman and Mark Rothko, and his friendship to Philip Guston, his involvement with a number of the abstract expressionist painters, which came out. He wrote a piece for de Kooning. He was very much involved in the aesthetic of abstract expressionism and finding a way to express that in music, which is unusual because usually the inspiration has gone in the reverse, where painters are trying to express what they hear in music, because music was always viewed as the abstract art that other arts kind of strove to achieve. But Morton Feldman really was involved with this idea of bringing that sense and of stillness to music, because we think music exists in time and it's usually happening in motion. And even in Morton Feldman's music, it happens in time, of course, but he slows down our sense of time. So you almost have the feeling of stasis, that this sound is happening and you're inside that sound. So I think it's very striking in that period. Another period where I'm really struck by it is the turn of the century, of the last century, of the 19th to the 20th century.
Right.
In a number of places, but in Vienna, for one, because you have the music of Brahms evolving, in a sense, into the music of Schoenberg. Arnold Schoenberg was tremendously influenced by both Johannes Brahms and by Richard Wagner, even though those two are often seen as opposites coming out of the 19th century. And at the same time, you have Sigmund Freud writing The Interpretation of Dreams, which is published in 1900. Brahms dies in 1897. Schoenberg is writing his early pieces at that time. And then in visual art, you have the artist Max Klinger, who was very dominant, and then the beginning of the secessionist movement, who were these artists who were exploring new ways of expressing what was really the unconscious, and the most notable of those artists probably being Gustav Klimt. So there, I think that's a time when these arts really speak to each other, the intellectual ideas, the literature, Arthur Schnitzler, besides the writings of Freud, there's this whole involvement with dreams, with the unconscious. And it's coming out in Schoenberg's New Harmonies. It's coming out in Gustav Klimt's paintings, seemingly of gardens, but actually very erotic and about other things. And so the music, the painting, the literature, the ideas of Sigmund Freud, they all really speak to each other and express a kind of zeitgeist, something that's going on in that time. And certain periods you see that more than others, certainly. I think the 60s and 70s in this country, you see that in the abstract expressionism. And then there's the whole movement around, Picasso and Stravinsky, and the parallels there are tremendous. The Picasso and something like Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and this very savage kind of cubist paintings, which correspond to the Rite of Spring. And then you have neoclassicism in Picasso and neoclassicism in Stravinsky. So, and then in Paris, a whole movement of neoclassicism that emerges, which is really a reaction against what I was talking about before, finding a way to write music that has nothing to do with Wagner, which was a big problem for a lot of people in the beginning of the 20th century. And Satie really helped them find a way out of that with a very simple, clean, non-chromatic sense of harmony and space, and something that we now associate with a real French aesthetic. It's interesting, I think, looking back, we look back in the early part of the 20th century and you see how localized and how different movements were in different countries. It's really fascinating when you think of, you know, what's going on in Vienna in 1908 and what's going on in Paris, and these things are very, very different. So yeah, I think there are, I mean, I love looking at that, you know, places where things overlap, or where you find in music a nonverbal expression of something that's expressed in words somewhere else.
How did you come to music?
Well, like many musicians, I grew up in a home where my mother was a musician. She was a violinist, and she taught in the house. So there was always music in the house. And so I can't really remember starting to play. It's a little bit like trying to remember learning how to read, you know?
Mhm.
Because you know, I was not in any way, you know, like a remarkable child prodigy at the age of 5. That was not my story. But I was always, you know, I first was playing the piano and my mother would help me, and I didn't have formal lessons. But by the time I started formal lessons, I already knew how to read music. And then when I was about 8 or 9, I guess, I started studying with a wonderful teacher in New York, in the city. I grew up in New York, but outside of the city. And then I started going to the Juilliard school when I was 11. Juilliard at that point was had moved to Lincoln Center, and they had a pre-college division, which I started studying at when I was 11, and that was something I absolutely adored. So, like most musicians, it's something I started when I was very young. I still, you know, collaborate and see people who I first met at Juilliard when I was 11 years old. It's a very small world, actually.
At what point did you know or suspect that music would be your life rather than just a sort of an avocation?
Well, you know, I think sometimes these very, very big questions come down to something very simple, which is how do you want to spend your time every day? You know,
Mhm.
much of what we do in life has to do with how we spend our time.
Mhm.
And what started happening for me was just I was spending more and more time practicing the piano. I was, you know, practicing the piano 3 hours a day, 4 hours a day. When I could, I was practicing the piano 6 hours a day, all because I really just wanted to be able to play certain pieces. It was really more like that. And I guess when I was 16 or 15, the summer that I turned 16, I went to a chamber music school in Maine and studied with the Polish pianist Archer Balsam. And one of the other musicians there was a student at Curtis Institute of Music. And when I went home, I was about to enter 11th grade. So I had 2 more years of high school, and I just decided I don't think I can last 2 more years of high school, and that I was going to audition for Curtis that year. So when I was 17, then I moved to Philadelphia and started going to the Curtis Institute. But I have to say, it really was about this idea that I needed to devote this time to practicing the piano. And if I went to any other kind of school, I wouldn't have the time to do that. And I think I really felt that. I mean, I was already, you know, very interested in a lot of other things than the piano, but it just seemed like the piano was what was going to encompass the most time and dedication at that point.
And what music were you listening to? What music had the strongest influence on you when you were growing up?
Well, you know, some of that hasn't changed all that much because I was late Beethoven was always like one of my things, playing late Beethoven, and I'm playing the last sonata, Opus 111, at my recital for DACAMERA in May. And for my audition at Curtis, I played Opus 109. I mean, that was something I think you find yourself in the music that you love the most. You know, the music that you love the most somehow tells you something about yourself. And Beethoven, late Beethoven was something I really connected with. Bach was something that I always loved. And I had already gotten involved with playing contemporary music before I went to Curtis, and I knew composers at Juilliard and had started playing some of their works. And then Curtis was a place which was pretty focused on 19th century music and older music, and there was not a tremendously active contemporary music scene there. And when I left Curtis, I went to Paris to study the music of Olivier Messiaen, who was still very alive and very active at that time, and I studied with his wife there.
Was the music world different in Paris than what you had experienced in the US?
Yeah. In Paris, I adore Paris. I adore French things. I'm
Mm.
very francophile. My husband is French, not at that time. But so I went off to Paris, and I loved Paris. I loved the music of Messiaen, and I loved studying with Ivan Loriot. But at the same time, I realized that my musical roots were very Russian German, and that it was a quite different tradition. Um, so I didn't feel perhaps as at home musically in Paris as I felt in a lot of other ways, and made the decision to come back to New York after a year there, but a very rewarding year. And then everything French and French culture became an important part of my life as well.
And what's your relationship to the music of Olivier Messiaen? How do you, in its totality, what are your conceptions of it? What do you think about it when somebody says Messiaen to you? What do you think?
Well, Messiaen is extremely denominational, right? He's very tied up with the Catholic religion. He was deeply religious himself, and I think it's impossible to think of Messiaen's music without recognizing this deep connection for him to spirituality, and specifically to Catholic dogma. I mean, he really felt like he created in his music a kind of universe that reflected the Catholic view of spirituality, of the Catholic religion. At the same time, just in a purely musical way, the music is incredibly rich with color. Um,
Mhm.
Messiaen saw colors with his harmonies, and it's incredibly inventive. And he also drew on many other cultures. Eastern cultures influenced his sense of rhythm, um, his sense of time, and his sense of time reflects something that we were talking about with Morton Feldman. It really reflects a larger sense of time. I think Messiaen's music is very much about not the individual, but the larger sense of human existence and the world and the planet. And Vision de la Main is a piece that he wrote for two pianos that I recorded with my colleague Marilyn Nonkin, who's a fantastic pianist who has specialized in lots of new music and who's the head of keyboard studies at NYU in New York. So that piece really starts out with the creation of the world out of nothing.
I think.
And so that music has really led me to one of my collaborations with the great lighting designer Jennifer Tipton has been around the music of Olivier Messiaen. So first she created a lit version of Vision de la Main, which we have wonderful images of, and which we actually streamed that performance last year during COVID. And then again, Jennifer came back and we created a version of Quartet for the End of Time, which is probably Messiaen's, definitely his best known work, and one of the few works of the post-war era that has entered the standard repertoire in such a deep way. It's a remarkable work. And she lit that beautifully as well. So the music really lends itself to something visual as well, in a very abstract sense.
You seem to say, you seem to have said it a few times since we've been talking, that your time at the piano is your thinking time. Is that a fair statement?
There's different kind of practicing. When you practice, there are all kinds of different things that one does. You know, there's the athletic side of practicing where you are staying in shape physically, and then there's an all-encompassing, you know, interpretive side. But at the same time, there's your mind is kind of left to free associate as well, and it's a very intimate time, but it's a time, I think, also where thinking happens that's not necessarily rational, and it's a kind of non-verbal thinking that frees up other things. I don't know, but I find that yes, I find that the piano is, you know, it's not like I'm at the piano and only thinking about other things, but it's more that while I'm in the process of working, ideas come to me, or thoughts come to me, or connections come to me. And a lot of my interdisciplinary work has been about trying to make visual and share with others the associations that I get when I'm at the piano. So the piece In the Garden of Dreams, which is a piece that I made about this turn of the century Vienna, and Brahms's music becoming like Schoenberg's music coming out of Brahms, I should say, and the visuals of the period and what was happening in terms of intellectual ideas. So those are things I'm at the piano and I'm thinking, this reminds me of that, and then eventually that turned into wanting to communicate that in some way, having other people have that experience of these connections. Or I'll be at the Menil collection and see a painting, and then when I'm practicing later, it will come to me that there's something similar about an experience I had in the museum and the experience I may be having at the piano.
You mentioned Tyshawn Sorey, that DACAMERA has commissioned to write a piece for the 50th anniversary of the Rothko Chapel. Talk a little bit about him as a composer, because he's quite fascinating, isn't he?
Yes, and Tyshawn, for many reasons, is someone who's such an ideal composer for DACAMERA to be working with, because DACAMERA is an organization, you know, we present such a diverse range of music, and we try to show connections between the music that we're presenting. So we present classical chamber music, and we present new works, and we present jazz. And increasingly, I think the lines between what's contemporary concert music and what's jazz have become blurred. And we've often presented composers who started out perhaps on our jazz series and then come back on our concert music series. And frankly, I wish we didn't even have to delineate between those things. And someday we won't. But Tyshawn Sorey has been on the experimental edge of jazz, and at the same time has pursued, you know, a career composing concert music, and has a doctorate from Columbia, and so worked with composers at Columbia who were his teachers, who were not involved in the world of jazz at all. And he is very much influenced by Morton Feldman, and I think feels a real spiritual connection to Feldman's music. Tyshawn is a brilliant percussionist himself, as well as being, you know, a keyboard player. He collaborates very often with the brilliant jazz pianist and composer Vijay Iyer. He used to play in Vijay's sextet, and they have a trio together that now just toured Europe. And Vijay is another one of these composers who comes out of the jazz world, but is now composing works for concert music ensembles, and has written me a piece that I will be premiering in May on that same recital with Beethoven's Last Sonata, and with Morton Feldman's last piano piece, actually, on that concert. So Tyshawn Sorey is a really remarkable figure. We first brought him to Houston for the performance of a work that he created for the soprano Julia Bullock, which was inspired by Josephine Baker, an iconic figure in Paris, and really showing a much more serious view of Josephine Baker and her work in for civil rights, which she got very involved in after coming back to the States. So he's got his musical expression is about a lot of things going on in the world today. He's very involved with justice, and so he seemed exactly the right kind of person to commission, as we did, for a new work for Rothko Chapel, which is both a response to the chapel and a response to Morton Feldman's work, Rothko Chapel.
And he was a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, wasn't he?
Yes, he's a MacArthur Fellow, and I don't know, the New York Times named him Composer of the Year. I mean, he's gotten a tremendous amount of attention recently. He's had works, let me see, the New Museum in New York, it devoted an entire room to one of his works, which you could listen to in an exhibit that they had last spring. And he has been performed by, major groups and festivals. He's very much in demand right now. Yes, MacArthur, and he's now a professor of composition at University of Pennsylvania. So he straddles many different worlds. Of course, the world of jazz is a world very tied up with improvisation. So he's a brilliant improviser, which we now associate with the world of jazz. But in Beethoven's day, Beethoven was the brilliant improviser. So in a way, a composer like Taishan Sori is bringing us back to the roots of composer-performers, which is how classical music originally evolved.
And I believe that Sori started out as a trombone player.
Yes, I think he was given a trombone in school. I think maybe that's how it started.
In many respects, he is the embodiment of DACAMERA, isn't he? That the divisions between concert music, classical music, and jazz are broken down because there are more commonalities than there are differences.
There really are, and I think more work needs to be done exploring what role race has played along the way in terms of why people were categorized as jazz musicians, why people developed as classical musicians. Some of the greatest jazz musicians, a singer like Nina Simone, really wanted to be a concert pianist. And Bach was very, very important to her. So it's a complicated issue, even how we regard certain kinds of music and why we would categorize something as jazz and something else, as concert music. And I think composers like Taishan Sori and Vijay Iyer are making us question those divisions. And one knows that, Stravinsky, Ravel, many, many European composers were influenced by jazz before jazz was embraced by the concert world in America. So ragtime that, Stravinsky wrote in the teens, I think he wrote his piece Ragtime. So there was a very early sense that the music that was developing primarily from Black musicians in America, developing as jazz, was something that was an influence on concert music composers in Europe. And that has happened increasingly. And also then there's this experimental branch of jazz that is more abstract than anything that's being written in the concert music world. So these divisions, jazz is an enormous world. It's, right. It's not just Benny Goodman. I mean, I think people have a concept of jazz that may be very narrow, but once you enter into the jazz world, you find out there's an enormous range of what goes on in the jazz world. And often when I'm at, some of our jazz concerts, I think, well, an audience that can get this is an audience that's going to be able to understand, Boulez, or respond to Elliott Carter, or respond to some of the most abstract, rhythmically complex music that's being created in the concert music world, or that was created, you know, in the late 20th century. So I think we're moving into a time where there are so many different styles happening in the concert music world, in the jazz world, that there are places where those divisions don't really tell us all that much, really.
Do you listen to music?
I have to say that I listen to music primarily. I mean, I think my most direct way of interacting with music is at the piano myself. And then, of course, I have the joy of going to all the DACAMERA programs that I've programmed. And then a lot of listening I do is related to programming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's related to research, to looking, to, you know, more than it is for me sitting down really to just enjoy music. Mainly that might be, you know, a time thing. But I think I get my connection to music through these different ways. You know, and I'll also you know, I'll often listen to music in my car, but usually there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have twins. Are they musical? Are you initiating them into this world that you have thrived in?
They're both extremely musical. My daughter has sung frequently in the Houston Grand Opera Children's Chorus, and my son is a very fine pianist. He studies with Tim Hester here in town, but he really plays for his own enjoyment rather than for performing. But practices seriously, and it gives me great joy when I hear him playing. You know, he's been going through the Well-Tempered Clavier and Chopin and Rachmaninoff, and yeah. So both of my kids are musical. They are not pursuing careers in music at this point, but they're 16 years old. Who knows what's going to happen down the road? Anything could happen.
Neither of them has taken lessons from you.
Oh no.
Look, Sarah, it's been a great joy to talk to you, and
pleasure, and great to see you again, St. John. It's been a while.
And thank you very much for sharing your life and your thoughts, and also for the tremendous collaborations with the Houston Chamber Choir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you to all who support the Houston Chamber Choir, our season underwriter, Silvercrest Asset Management Group, our patrons, donors, and subscribers. We appreciate all you do to help keep the work of the Houston Chamber Choir possible. I'm St. John Flynn, and this is Behind the Music. Join us again next time.
The Houston Chamber Choirs with One Accord is your one-stop shop for choral joy. If you enjoyed this podcast, help us to continue our mission to grow the esteem and appreciation of choral music by sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to our content. As a 501c3 nonprofit, support from listeners like you allows us to continue to create new and exciting programming. For more information about us and how you can support our work, please visit HoustonChamberChoir.org/give.